Welcome to the Mystery and Horror channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1. The Cabin in the Mountains. My family always loved outdoor adventures. When we decided to rent a cabin in the mountains for a weekend away from the city, the idea seemed perfect. The cabin was nestled in the middle of a dense forest, with a trail to the door flanked by tall pines that blocked the sunlight, leaving the area perpetually in shadow. We arrived in the early afternoon, and the fresh air and tranquility of the place were invigorating. On the first night, we sat around the fireplace, listening to old stories my father told about hunters and explorers who faced the mountains. As the flames crackled, the feeling of being in such an isolated place brought a mixture of peace and unease. Later, when everyone went to bed, I woke up to a faint sound like a long whistle coming from outside. I looked out the bedroom window but saw only the darkness of the forest. The next morning, I mentioned the sound to my father, who laughed and said it must have been the wind. But that night was different. I woke up again, but this time to the sound of light footsteps on the living room floor. I remained silent, holding my breath as the steps continued and stopped by my bedroom door. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine when I heard a soft scratching sound, like nails scraping the wood. Summoning all the courage I had, I got up and opened the door. The living room was empty, the fireplace had burned out, and everything was cloaked in shadows. The silence was so profound I could hear my own breathing. I decided to go back to bed, but before closing the door, I saw something at the living room window. A shadow passed by quickly, and eyes that seemed to glow faintly stood out for a second before disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, I insisted I had seen something, but my parents again attributed it to tiredness and imagination. We spent the day exploring the forest, but the feeling of being watched never left me. At night, the tension grew. The whistle returned, louder and closer this time. My mother heard it too and exchanged a worried look with my father. Something was wrong and we all felt it. When the whistle stopped, silence reigned again, but not for long. A loud thud at the cabin door startled us. My father grabbed a flashlight and approached cautiously, asking who was outside. Receiving no answer, he carefully opened the door and shone the light, revealing only the empty forest and the trail disappearing among the trees. The night dragged on and we all stayed awake, alert for any sound. Suddenly, we heard a distant scream, something between a wail and a roar that echoed through the mountain, causing the entire cabin to tremble slightly. My mother suggested we head home at dawn, and we all agreed as fear had already sunk in deep. When the sun finally rose, we quickly gathered our things. Before we left, I took one last look out the window. In the shadows of the forest, I saw an immobile figure, tall and thin, with glowing eyes watching me without blinking. I closed the curtain quickly and got into the car without saying a word. To this day, when I think of the cabin in the mountains, I remember the feeling of being watched and the whistle that seemed to come from all around. I never returned, but sometimes, on cold and quiet nights, I swear I can hear that same whistle whispering in the wind, like a call that was never answered. Story 2. The Cemetery on the Hill. There was a cemetery in my town that sat atop a lonely hill. It was old, with tombstones whose inscriptions had been worn away by time and vegetation that crept over everything around it. There were many stories about that place, from sightings of shadows to inexplicable sounds during the night. But for me and my friends, it was just a source of laughter and teenage dares. One autumn night, we decided to go there to test our courage. The path to the hill was narrow, lined with trees whose twisted branches formed eerie silhouettes under the moonlight. The wind rustled through the dry leaves, creating a whispering sound that seemed to follow our steps. When we finally reached the rusty iron gate, we pushed it open with a loud creak that echoed into the darkness. The cemetery was enveloped in an oppressive silence. The flashlights in our hands cast dancing shadows among the graves, and the sensation of being watched was undeniable. Lucas, the bravest of our group, suggested we walk to the mausoleum in the center of the cemetery, a small stone building where an old town resident accused of witchcraft was said to be buried. We approached, laughing nervously, but as we got closer to the mausoleum, the laughter faded. The air grew colder, and a strong smell of damp earth and something metallic filled the space. Then we heard it, a soft, dragging sound as if something were being pulled over the stones. We froze, and Lucas's flashlight began to flicker. He tapped it a few times before it went out completely, leaving us partially in the dark. I tried to focus my flashlight on the mausoleum, but the beam was weak and trembling in my hand. The sound continued, and suddenly, a faint whisper cut through the air. "You shouldn't be here." My friends looked at me with wide eyes, and I realized everyone had heard it. Paolo, usually the composed one, whispered that we should leave. But before we could move, the mausoleum door, which seemed to have been locked for decades, creaked open with a dry snap. Inside it was pitch black, but something glowed faintly. It was a pair of small, glowing eyes that seemed to study each of us. A low, guttural sound emanated from within, somewhere between a growl and a deep sigh. Lucas stepped back, stumbling and falling to the ground. The noise caused him to drop his flashlight, which rolled to the entrance of the mausoleum, partially illuminating the interior. For a brief moment, we saw a crouched figure with elongated limbs and a face obscured by shadow. No one needed to say anything more. We ran, leaving the flashlight and any remaining courage behind. The sound of heavy footsteps followed us for a few meters, but when I looked back, there was nothing but darkness and the old tombstones. We reached the gate and shut it with a desperate push, gasping for breath. The silence returned, but the cemetery felt more alive than ever. The next morning, Lucas returned with some townsfolk to retrieve the flashlight and share what had happened, but they found the mausoleum closed and locked as it had always been. No one believed our story, attributing it to our imagination and collective fear. But we knew what we had seen and heard. To this day, when night falls and the mist shrouds the hill, I avoid looking in that direction. Those glowing eyes and the whisper that warned us still echo in my mind, as if reminding me that some secrets are meant to be respected and some places are best left untouched. Story 3. The room at the end of the hall. When my family bought a big old house, everyone was excited. It was made of red brick, with an imposing look and tall windows that let sunlight flood into the rooms during the day. However, there was one room at the end of the hallway on the second floor that always seemed darker than the rest of the house. Even with the curtains open, the light seemed to hesitate before entering, creating a shadowy, heavy atmosphere. Nobody wanted to use the room, so it became a sort of storage space filled with forgotten and old items. From the first night in the house, I sensed something was off. The nighttime silence was broken by faint footsteps in the hallway, pacing back and forth as if someone were walking from one end to the other. I thought it was my dad, but when I asked, he said he hadn't left the bed. My parents also started hearing the same footsteps, but they ignored them, thinking it was just the old wood creaking in the wind. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft whisper coming from the hallway. I got up cautiously and opened my bedroom door. The hallway was dark, except for a dim light from the lamp at the far end. A chill ran down my spine when I noticed that the door to the room at the end of the hall, which was always closed, was now slightly ajar. A low murmuring sound came from inside. With my heart pounding, I convinced myself it was just the wind. I pushed the door, which creaked as it opened, revealing the nearly empty room with only a few boxes and a large, dusty mirror leaning against the wall. The air was cold, and an uncomfortable feeling washed over me. As I turned to leave, I saw something in the mirror that made my blood run cold. A tall, thin shadow stood behind me, with eyes so dark they seemed to absorb all light. I spun around, but there was nothing there. However, the mirror still reflected the figure clearly. The whisper came back, louder this time, saying, "Get out." The door slammed shut, and the sound echoed throughout the house. I started banging on the door and yelling, and within seconds my parents appeared, forcing the door open. When they finally managed to get it open, the shadow was gone, and the room returned to its lifeless state. I told them what I had seen, but my parents tried to calm me down, saying I must have imagined it due to being tired. But that night was just the beginning. Each day, the door to the room at the end of the hall seemed to open a little wider, and the whisper returned, always saying the same thing, "Get out." My parents began to hear it too, and my mother, a practical and skeptical woman, admitted she once saw the shadow in the mirror out of the corner of her eye. After a few weeks, an elderly neighbor visited us, and when he mentioned the room, he turned pale. He told us that decades ago, a solitary man who lived in the house was found dead in that room, surrounded by strange drawings and a mirror covered with symbols no one could decipher. Since then, the room had been considered cursed, but the story had faded over time. That night, we decided to lock the room with an old key we found in the basement and cover the mirror with a sheet. The whisper continued, but gradually weakened until it became an occasional sound. Though we lived in the house for many years, we never used that room again. To this day, when I visit my parents and pass by the hallway, I can feel the invisible eyes of the figure watching me, waiting for the day the door will be opened once more. Story 4. The Light on the Deserted Road. One night, I was driving home after visiting a friend in a neighboring town. The road that connected the two towns was long and deserted, cutting through fields and small forests that seemed endless at night. The sky was overcast, and the only light came from my car's headlights and the moon, which barely pierced the thick clouds. The hum of the engine and the slight noise of the tires on the asphalt were my only companions. Suddenly, I noticed a light in the distance. A small yellowish orb floating above the road, swaying gently from side to side. I slowed down, intrigued and a bit wary. The light was different from car headlights or street lamps. It had an ancient glow, almost like a flame. As I approached, it moved away, shifting to the edge of the road and stopping near a twisted tree that looked even darker under the night sky. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out, despite my instincts telling me to keep driving. Curiosity had taken over. The light continued to sway, and behind it, I noticed a narrow path leading into the woods. The sound of crickets and the rustling of leaves created an unsettling backdrop, but I couldn't take my eyes off the light. I took a few steps toward it, feeling the air around me grow colder. Suddenly, the light went out and silence fell around me. An eerie chill ran down my spine when I realized I couldn't hear anything, not even the usual nighttime sounds. Just as I was about to head back to my car, I heard a low, dragging whisper that seemed to come from all directions. It was a voice I didn't recognize, saying words I couldn't understand, but that made me shiver. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and I felt the sensation of being watched, as if something was hiding among the trees. I glanced back and saw a shadow moving quickly between the trunks. My muscles tensed and fear made me step back. Before I could turn fully, the light reappeared, this time much closer, only a few feet away. It pulsed gently, emitting a strange warmth that made my skin tingle. The voice returned, clearer now, saying, "Go back." I didn't hesitate any longer. I sprinted to my car, nearly tripping over the stones and roots on the roadside. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and looked in the rearview mirror, seeing the light retreating slowly, rising until it disappeared into the forest darkness. The car engine roared to life and I sped off, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next day, I told the story to an older colleague at work who stared at me with wide eyes. He said that decades ago, a couple had gone missing on that road, and witnesses reported seeing a mysterious light that lured them into the woods. Some believed it was a lost soul, while others thought it was something older and darker that either protected or hunted anyone who ventured too close. Since then, I avoid that road at night. And on the rare occasions when I have to drive there, my eyes constantly scan the trees, searching for the light, hoping it won't reappear. But even without seeing it, I can still feel that pulsing warmth and the whisper of the night that warned me, as if something were still lurking, watching for those who don't heed its warning to turn back. Story 5. The Cellar on 12th Street. When we were kids, there was a house on 12th Street that everyone feared. It was an old structure with loose wooden planks and windows that always seemed dark, even during the day. They said the house had been empty for years, ever since the last occupant, a reclusive and eccentric man, disappeared without a trace. Neighborhood kids swore they saw shadows moving behind the curtains and heard low, muffled sounds coming from the cellar. I never believed those stories until the summer when I decided to explore the house with my best friend, Andre. One Saturday afternoon, while the sun was still bright, we gathered outside the house with flashlights and ropes, ready for our expedition. The rusty gate swung open easily, emitting a sound that sent shivers down my spine. The front door was locked, but Andre, with a nervous smile, found an open window on the side and climbed in first. I followed, met by the musty, decaying smell of old wood and dust. Inside, the house was even more eerie than it appeared from outside. Old furniture covered in dusty sheets cast unsettling shadows, and the floor creaked with every step. We moved slowly, our flashlights revealing dark corners and cracks in the walls. That's when we heard it, a faint scratching sound from below us. Andre pointed to a wooden door leading to the cellar, slightly ajar, and we exchanged a look that was part excitement, part dread. We descended the stairs cautiously, each step groaning under our weight. The air in the cellar was thick, carrying the scent of damp earth and rust. It was spacious, filled with old furniture and stacked boxes, but what caught our attention was an old armchair facing the wall, as if someone had been sitting there, staring at a fixed point. As we approached, the sense of wrongness intensified. A chill ran down my spine, and a low, almost imperceptible whisper filled the cellar. "Leave." Andre's eyes widened, and before we could react, the armchair slowly turned as if pushed by invisible hands. It was empty, but the motion was enough to make us step back. That's when we noticed an old photograph in one of the open boxes. It showed a tall man with an intense gaze and a crooked smile standing in front of the same armchair. Behind him, a vague shadow loomed on the wall. Before we could process what we were seeing, the sound of light footsteps echoed from the stairs, as if someone was climbing them. But there was no one there. Andre yelled for us to get out, and we scrambled up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind us. The house seemed to come alive, with creaks and echoes following us to the window we had entered. We jumped out, and only then did we notice that the sun was setting, casting long, threatening shadows over the street. I looked back and, for a brief second, saw the silhouette of a tall man in the cellar window, the same intense look from the photo. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but that felt like a warning. From that day on, the house on 12th Street became more than just a neighborhood legend. We avoided it, and on nights when the wind howled through the streets, I could still hear the sound of footsteps and the echo of the whisper, as if the house wanted to remind us that we had gone too far. Even now, when I tell this story, I feel the same chill as that afternoon when I saw the figure in the window. The house on 12th Street remains vacant, but those who know its story understand that behind those dark windows, something or someone still watches, waiting for new visitors bold enough to enter. Story 6: The Clock Tower. In my town, there was a clock tower that rose in the center of the main square. Built in the late 19th century, it was an imposing structure with long, heavy hands that marked time with precision. Over the years, the tower was abandoned and the clock stopped working. People said that after the old caretaker's death, something strange had happened there. They spoke of hearing the chimes even though the mechanism was no longer functional, and of seeing a faint light flickering in the tower windows late at night. One day, my friend Roberto suggested we explore the tower. He was always the bravest among us, and the idea of uncovering whether the stories were true intrigued me, despite the underlying fear. One autumn night, armed with flashlights and steely nerves, we met at the square. The town was quiet, and the moon cast long shadows across the empty streets. The tower's door was locked, but Roberto, with a mischievous grin, showed me an old key he'd found in his grandfather's workshop. His grandfather had once worked as a blacksmith maintaining the tower decades earlier. The key turned with a heavy click, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dusty staircase winding upward. The air was cold and smelled of old oil and rust. We climbed slowly, the stairs echoing beneath our feet. The walls were covered in inscriptions left by workers and visitors, messages and dates over 100 years old. As we neared the top, the silence was broken by a faint, mechanical sound, as if the clock were trying to come back to life. Roberto and I exchanged wide-eyed looks but continued to climb. When we reached the clock chamber, the temperature felt even colder, as if time itself had frozen there. The giant gears and immobile clock hands made for an intimidating sight. But what drew our attention was a faint light flickering behind the clock face, like a wavering flame casting shadows that danced across the walls. Roberto stepped closer to see where the light was coming from, and then we heard a sound that made our hearts stop for a moment. The deep echo of a bell chime, even though the mechanism was visibly inactive. The sound reverberated through the tower, and I felt the floor tremble beneath my feet. The light flared brighter, and for an instant, I saw a shadow projected on the opposite wall. A tall, skeletal figure that seemed to be wearing a hood. Before we could react, the shadow moved and a low, hoarse voice echoed through the chamber. "Time does not forgive." Roberto shouted and ran for the stairs, but before I could follow, the light went out abruptly, plunging the chamber into darkness. The sound of the bell echoed again, louder and closer, as if something unseen were passing by me. I bolted down the stairs as fast as I could, stumbling as the cold air seemed to push me downward. When we burst out of the tower, we slammed the door shut and ran to the other side of the square without looking back. The silence around us felt heavier than before. The next day, we shared our story with some of the older residents, who listened in silence before mentioning that the caretaker had mysteriously disappeared just before the clock stopped. Legend had it that he had made a pact with time to protect the town, but that something had gone wrong, trapping his soul in the tower. Since then, the shadow I saw and the sound of the bell still appear in my dreams, reminding me that time, in its relentless march, holds more secrets than we can comprehend. Story 7. The Voice in the Well. When I was a child, I used to spend my vacations at my grandmother's house, nestled in a rural area surrounded by fields and forests. In her backyard, there was an old well made of uneven stones, covered by a wooden lid always secured with a heavy chain. My grandmother, a wise woman steeped in superstition, would tell me never to go near the well, as it held secrets better left unknown. One afternoon, while playing alone, curiosity got the better of me. I glanced at the well from a distance, noting the worn, weathered lid that seemed to beckon, challenging her warnings. The sky had started to cloud over, and the wind blew gently, making the leaves whisper. I inched closer, trying to hear if there really was anything strange about it, and then I heard it, a faint sound, barely perceptible, coming from the depths of the well. It was a voice calling my name in a drawn-out, soft whisper, as if coming from very far away. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The voice came again, clearer this time, and a chill swept through me from head to toe. It was a woman's voice, weary and melancholic, calling my name, pleading for something I couldn't comprehend. The fear was so intense that I took a step back, stumbling and landing on the grass. The voice stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt more oppressive than the whisper itself. I glanced around, half expecting my grandmother to appear and tell me it was just the wind playing tricks. But I was alone. The well's lid now looked even more sinister, as though it were laughing at my childish curiosity. I scrambled to my feet and ran back inside. My grandmother noticed my pale face and asked what had happened. Stammering, I told her about the voice, and her face turned grave in a way I had never seen before. She sat next to me and began telling a story she'd never mentioned before. Many years ago, when my grandmother was young, a girl from the village had disappeared. They searched for her for days but found nothing. The last people who saw her said she had been standing near the well, staring into its depths as if listening to something. Ever since then, the legend said that the girl's spirit roamed the area, calling out for help, trapped somewhere between life and death. My grandmother reiterated that I should never go near the well again. That night, she locked the back door and barricaded it with chairs, as if afraid that something might come inside. I barely slept, haunted by dreams where the voice called to me, each time more insistent and desperate. In one dream, I looked into the well and saw a pale hand reaching up, pleading for me to pull it out. The next morning, I woke up to a noise from the backyard. Looking out the window, I saw the well's lid slightly ajar, the chain broken as if something had forced its way out. I ran to tell my grandmother, but she was already outside, her expression determined as she held a rosary in her hands. Without a word, she closed the lid and secured it with a stronger chain, muttering prayers under her breath. I never went near the well again. Though years have passed and my grandmother's house has been sold, I still dream of that voice calling my name, waiting for the day when I might return and hear its lost plea once more. Story 8, The Locked Attic. When my family moved into a century-old house in a historic neighborhood, I was fascinated by its architecture and antique details. There was something majestic about its wide hallways and rooms with tall windows. But the most intriguing feature was the attic. It was the only part of the house that always remained locked. My father said it was just an old storage space filled with dust and broken items, but the look on his face suggested there was more to the story. For the first few weeks, I tried to ignore my curiosity about the attic, but it grew with each passing day. At night, when the house was silent, I could swear I heard sounds coming from above. A faint shuffling of feet and muffled whispers, as if someone was moving in the shadows. When I asked my mother about it, she brushed it off, saying it was just the old beams creaking in the wind. I wasn't convinced. One night, I woke to a loud thump, as if something had fallen in the attic. I got out of bed hesitantly and walked into the hallway, lit only by the dim light of the moon streaming through the windows. The attic door, which was always locked, was now slightly ajar. The air around it felt colder, and a chill ran down my spine. My heart raced, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I climbed the creaking stairs, each step echoing in the quiet house. The smell of old wood and mustiness was overwhelming, and the darkness seemed to envelop me. At the top, the attic was filled with old furniture draped in yellowed sheets, boxes piled high, and old toys. A porcelain doll with a faded smile stared at me from a corner, its glass eyes catching the beam of my flashlight. Suddenly, a soft sound of footsteps behind me made me spin around. There was no one there, but the doll now seemed to be facing me, its head tilted slightly as if watching. A shiver raced down my spine as I took a step back, nearly tripping over a box. That's when I heard the whisper, weak and drawn out, surrounding me as though it came from every direction. "Why did you come back?" the voice said, almost accusatory. The attic door slammed shut with a loud bang, and the darkness deepened. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my voice felt swallowed up by the space, as though muffled by something unseen. The doll, with its pale, cracked face, seemed closer now. A cold breath touched the back of my neck, and the whisper returned, louder this time, "You shouldn't be here." Heart pounding, I pushed against the door until it gave way, and I stumbled into the hallway, bathed in moonlight. My parents came running, startled by the noise, and found me pale and shaking. I told them what happened, and my mother exchanged a worried glance with my father. He shut the attic door with a key I'd never seen before, saying it should remain locked. Later, my father admitted that the attic had once been a bedroom for a girl who lived in the house decades ago. She had mysteriously disappeared and was never found. Every family that lived there after reported hearing whispers and seeing unexplained movements. Years later, I still recall that night with a shudder. I never went back to the attic, but whenever I visit the house, I can feel the gaze of something unseen from the top of the stairs, waiting with a whisper that never fully fades. Story 9, The Music Room. When I started teaching piano, one of the first homes I worked at was an old mansion at the end of the main street in town. It had once belonged to a prominent family but was now occupied by an elderly woman named Mrs. Clara, who lived there alone. She had hired me to teach her granddaughter, Helena, who was staying with her during the holidays. The mansion was enormous, with hallways that seemed to stretch on forever and rooms that echoed every sound. But the most intriguing space was the music room. The music room was located at the end of a dim, narrow corridor. It was a spacious room with tall windows draped in heavy red velvet curtains. In the center stood a grand black piano that gleamed under the faint light seeping through the gaps in the fabric. The walls were adorned with old sheet music and portraits of musicians who seemed to watch me as I passed. Helena was a sweet girl, but she always seemed uneasy when our lesson ended, casting nervous glances at the piano before darting off to her grandmother. One afternoon, while waiting for Helena to arrive, I decided to play a piece to pass the time. The piano notes resonated through the room, producing a soft, haunting melody, but something felt off. One of the keys played a sharper note than it should have, as if someone had pressed it with me. I looked around, but the room was empty. The sense of being watched intensified, and the air turned cold as if a draft was brushing past me. Helena entered with a wary look and told me she didn't like practicing in that room. I asked her why, and she whispered that she often heard whispers when she was alone. A chill ran down my spine, but I maintained a calm demeanor and encouraged her to start the lesson. As she played, a soft tapping noise, like a hand drumming lightly on wood, echoed from the piano. Helena stopped abruptly, and our eyes met in silent agreement. Something was in the room. Mrs. Clara appeared in the doorway, her face pale and anxious. She glanced at us, then spoke in a hushed tone, saying the lesson was over. She locked the music room door, murmuring that it would be best to keep it closed for a while. Later that day, she explained that her older brother had mysteriously vanished many years ago and was last seen playing that very piano. Since then, strange noises, whispers, and shadowy movements had become a regular occurrence. Over the following weeks, the music room remained locked, but the mansion itself seemed different at night. Mrs. Clara and Helena reported hearing music, mournful piano notes drifting through the halls, filling the air with an indescribable heaviness. One night, I was invited to return to investigate. We entered the room with a flashlight in hand and saw that the piano's lid was open, and its keys were moving as if pressed by invisible fingers. The tune was the same melody I had played that afternoon, but now it sounded more sorrowful, almost like a lament. Mrs. Clara, tears brimming in her eyes, whispered her brother's name, and the piano abruptly stopped. Silence engulfed the room, and for a moment, it felt as if time itself had frozen. The lid of the piano slowly closed on its own, landing with a muted thud, and a chill breeze passed through, making the curtains sway slightly. From that night on, the music room remained permanently locked, and Mrs. Clara never spoke of her brother again. Helena stopped taking piano lessons, and the mansion went back to being a place of echoes and memories. But sometimes, when I walk past and glance at the covered windows, I could swear I hear that lost melody faintly playing, as if the piano still waits, longing for someone to hear its unfinished story. Story 10. The Book from the Old Bookstore. In my town, there was an old bookstore that few people ever visited. The place was dimly lit, with shelves that reached almost to the ceiling, packed with books of every kind. The owner, an elderly man with white hair and thick glasses, rarely spoke, preferring to watch visitors with a distant gaze. Rumor had it that he lived on the floor above the shop, behind a round window whose curtains were never drawn. The store smelled of old paper and a sweetness I couldn't identify, and on one rainy day, I decided to explore more thoroughly. As I scanned the dusty shelves, my eyes fell on a book that seemed out of place. It had a black leather cover and a metal clasp, with no title or author, only a symbol that looked like a cross between an eye and a star. I pulled the book from the shelf, and a chill ran up my spine as though I had done something forbidden. I undid the clasp and turned the first page. The handwriting was strange, looping and hurried, and in a language I didn't recognize. As I flipped another page, a soft whisper filled the air. I glanced around, but the only other person there was the old shopkeeper, who was now watching me intently. The whisper grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the book itself. The words seemed to shift on the page, rearranging themselves into sentences I could understand. "They see when you read," said the last line. Startled, I shut the book with a snap and looked at the owner, who had suddenly appeared beside me, so close I could feel his cool breath. "You shouldn't have touched that," he said in a slow, gravelly voice. The air in the shop felt thicker, and the light filtering through the windows seemed dimmer, tinged with a sickly yellow hue. I hastily returned the book to the shelf, but the whisper didn't stop. It now echoed in my mind. The owner walked me to the door without another word and shut it behind me with a definitive click. The rain continued, sounding muted, overpowered by something deeper. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the book and the whisper. I tried to sleep but woke up to that same murmuring, as if someone were talking at the foot of my bed. I turned on the light, but my room was empty. The clock read 3:33 a.m., and the silence of the night was broken only by the whisper, now clearer, repeating, "They are here." The following nights were the same. The whisper followed me, and I could swear shadows moved just beyond the edge of my vision. I returned to the bookstore only to find it closed. The round window's curtain was slightly ajar, showing a faint, flickering light as if from a candle struggling to stay lit. I told a friend about my experience, and though he laughed it off, he agreed to come with me to the bookstore. When we arrived, the owner met us with a stern expression. "I told you not to touch that book," he said before I could speak. My friend looked at me puzzled, and the old man continued, "Now they know you saw them. And they won't let you be." Before we could ask who they were, the shop lights flickered, and the whisper filled the air, surrounding us like a choir of unseen voices. The owner pushed us out and locked the door behind us. That night, a thick fog enveloped the town, and the voices didn't stop. The sound came from the walls, the floor, and the darkness itself. Since then, I've avoided the bookstore. They say the old man passed away not long after, and the store was permanently closed. But those who pass by at night swear they can still hear a soft whisper, as if the words from that book continue to be read, searching for someone who dares to open its pages again. If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next terror.